So one of the things you're going to realize is that right now I'm just kind of roughing these things in. So my colors uh, aren't super great. But the idea is that it's working. Things are collapsing and stacking as expected. Now, one of the things you want to do is, of course, you'll have your own style. Column 8, column 4. I can make this white. Control save. And these colors can be modified just to make things a little bit more easy to see. But everything is working, and that's what I want you to see. Now, as you move along, at this particular point, you're basically going to be just blocking in your divs, your main divs, your rows, and then what's inside of that row. Perhaps it's multiple columns, perhaps it is more rows. But the thing is, it can get as complex as you want by simply just adding in rows and columns to divvy things out. So if you want your column to be a sidebar or something else, it's going to hold containers. You'll certainly want to be working with that and using it however you want and dividing it up. Now I have an example where I've put these different types of rows, I mixed and matched them to show kind of how you would do it. So I'm doing exactly what I did in my first example, where I have my main fluid container, and then I put in a banner, and that's where I could put in an image or something else. So I have my banner. I'm putting text in there just to fill the space. So you can see this is where the banner content is. Okay. Then the banner ends right here. I have a comment, and then the row for that ends right there. So that's a row, and it's going to just contain itself up there. I'm going to start a new row. I've given it a new designation of a row here. I've called it multiple columns row, and that is where I'm going to put in 3 columns. And so essentially I start my multiple columns row. I put in my first column, my second column, and I give them the numbers, 6, 4, and 2. So 6 plus 4 is 10 plus 2 is 12. So that's going to take up the whole space there of my row. That's the idea. It's not showing up very well here, and I'll look at it in just a second in actual browser. So that's the end of of that particular row right there. So there's the end of my row. Now, if I wanted to do something else, here is another way to divide things out. I have a row. Okay, my row is going to begin here, and then I'm going to have a column on my my left. Okay, and it's going to take up 10 of the grid. And then I have another column that's going to take up 2. But in that, I'm going to put in a row and columns inside of that. So I have a new column with elements inside of it. So they're going to be sitting inside of another column. So this gets kind of complicated a little bit, but not so much if you just think about what's happening. Here's my new row is this space. Inside of that row I have a column, and that column ends right here. It just has, we can put some text in here. It's going to take up the left side. Oops, I spelled that wrong. All right. And I have that inside of there. Then I'm going to have a column on the right, and this column on the right is going to contain and it's only going to take up 2. So 10 plus 2 is 12. So that takes up all the space in that row. And then inside of that column, I'm going to break that down into a couple more columns, 3 more columns. Then I put those in there. So I have my right column, and my left, my row, and then my division, and all of these things are getting closed. So essentially I've got a row with a column that's got 2 columns in it, and then one of those columns is broken down into a new row and new columns. And so if I look at this, and if I look at this in my browser, I start to get a column that's broken down into multiple parts. So you can see that I have my banner here, it's in this green. Then I have a new row, and it contains 1, 2, 3 columns. And then I'm going to have a new row that contains this left column, and then I'm going to have a right column. And that has columns in that. So I have a left column inside of there, a middle column, and a right column. And so what I want to make sure is happening is that when these columns begin to get smaller, when the browser window is laid out in a different view, notice how they're still side by side, but then they start to stack. Notice how those changed, and these are going to stack now. And so these columns begin to stack nicely, and then these columns begin to stack nicely. And the point of this is just so that you can see how you just start to you nest columns inside of each other, and nest columns inside of rows. I wouldn't try to make things too complicated, but just keep it as simple as possible. Otherwise it can become quite confusing. But the idea is you can lay out your page. Say you wanted that banner image. Well, I put my banner image in here. I'm going to start anew. Maybe I've got navigation up here. Maybe I want to start putting content up here, but I can break that down into smaller and smaller containers. I can put my footer at the bottom. Maybe I simply just put a footer in at the bottom. Maybe it'll be the same color as here's my main container. Here's my 2 row. And let's say then after here I want to put in a div. It's going to be a class equal row. I'm going to give it an ID. Before I do that, I want to make sure I always like to put in my labels before I get too carried away. So here is my row. I'm going to give it an ID. Just so that I can keep track of it. And then inside of that, I will add in my container. In this particular case, it's going to be a fluid container because I don't need to break this up. So say class container fluid. And I'm going to close it and make sure I label it. If I did everything right, I should see a new row and a new footer right here, and then I can give that footer its own color. So I could go in here and I could put in a footer. If I wanted to, I could give it I could just add this to the class. Copy. And it should give it a nice soft. Now this already had width and height on it, but you can see that I can set up my own classes for that. Let me go back to my browser here and refresh and see if everything that I did worked. And there's my footer. So I've got my banner, my footer, and all the content in between. And I can put whatever I want to in there, but everything cascades and lays out quite nicely. All right, I hope that helps with the idea of laying things out. So that's the basic of a layout. You can try, what I would do is I would practice these basic ideas. Before I started adding pictures, before I added drop-down menus, before I added galleries, I would just make sure I understood how can I lay out a page using Bootstrap that gives me the core basic containers that I need. Try doing things without designating a row. See what happens. Try doing things without with other things, and see why you follow certain procedures, and see if anything changes. Try using HTML5, footers, nav, and all that sort of stuff, and just experiment. So you yourself are understanding what works best for you. Maybe you want to do it a certain way that makes more sense to you, less confusing, and that's something I think everyone needs to kind of understand, so that you're not just rotely going through a step, but you really kind of understand what you're doing, so that you have a more mastery over it, so that you can look at something and say, oh yeah, I see what they're doing. They're just doing this, this, and that, and this is on the side, and I get it. And then build up. Don't get too overwhelmed with everything else. So I hope that helped, and just like I say, keep practicing.